So now over to Monty to address some of the points that Richard has raised.
Well, Richard said about organics now sort of being sexy and people being afraid to put their head above the parapet. I mean, well, two things. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, I still get ridiculed. I don't consider myself a well-established wine person, but I still get people really having a go at me. 15 years ago when I started, I remember going to the Institute of Masters of Wine and saying, why is organic and biodynamic not even on your syllabus? Organics was recognised in 1990 in the United States. It was recognised by the European Union in 1992. And it wasn't on their syllabus. I found that absolutely shocking. I also found it shocking that their logo is still a 4-lobed vine leaf and not a 5-lobed vine leaf, but we'll talk about that another time. And I think if legally there is a separate section for organic and biodynamic, because it is controlled by law, then I think it's right that in a bookshop or whatever you have an organic and biodynamic wine section. I don't really see what the big problem is about that Richard raised. One area where I do agree about Richard is I don't agree with kind of scare stories about if you drink this wine it's conventional you're going to die, because I think that it's not true. Jeff Taylor at Courtwise, who's a leading analytical chemist in this country for wine, I think he's the #1. I've asked him many occasions, do these residues end up in wine from say systemic sprays actually penetrate the sap of a vine? And he says no, they get washed out by the fermentation process. Sometimes they may get through, but it's not systematic that residues are ending up in our wine. Is that a reason not to worry? No, but where are these residues going? Because these are persistent products, and so they can run off into our water supply. And you know, atrazine, for example, which is a conventional spray applied in the 50s or 60s, is still in our water supply. And this water that we've got from the tap contains residues. Now, I think if we can avoid using those products, we can then stop having these arguments about this is safe or this isn't unsafe, and working in a more natural way with products that don't leave residues. When Richard says that he doesn't feel that, unlike the chemical products, that they're very controlled, they're controlled by the government, they're tested by scientists. Well, one issue that we know is big agribusiness that needs to make a profit on these sprays can lean on governments. We've seen it very clearly in the US, both for organic and non-organic, where the organic standards in the US have been very weakened by big agribusiness wanting to get in organics. And we know that the standards, for example, for GM in the USA, in the US government, a GM tomato is exactly the same as a normal tomato, non-GM tomatoes. In the eyes of the law, they are both the same, even though one has a foreign gene inserted into it. So we know that big business, whether it's organic big business or big business in general, can push down standards. And I think in Europe we have got a more robust, I think, organic system. And the biodynamic preparations are controlled. For example, for E. coli, there are rules in the European Union about using animal organs or cow horns when you're making your biodynamic preparations. None of these animal organs actually end up in your compost or in your vineyard, but they're used as a sheath, as a container, if you like, to make some of the biodynamic preparations that go into compost. But if you're spraying a compost tea, for example, and you're in Europe and you're exporting your wine to the US, you can't spray it within 90 days of the harvest because it's a crop that's going to end up in someone's mouth. You can spray it within 120 days. You can spread on the soil, but not on the crop. So there are rules that govern the use of organic sprays, just as there are rules governing the use of conventional sprays. And you know, Richard's pulled out a couple of examples of Martinborough, New Zealand vineyards. He says nitrogen and water deficiency. Well, over irrigation is a massive problem. We're water poor now. As a planet, we're getting clean fresh water poor. So if somebody has a slightly water deficient water vineyard, I think that's a great thing, because it'll be lower yields and less waste water. Wine is not a product that we need to have. We do need to eat bread, we need to eat vegetables and fruit. Wine is a luxury product. It's not a product that we need for our existence. And in terms of nitrogen deficiency, okay, Richard's seen a vineyard that has N deficiency. I've seen thousands of vineyards with excess potassium, magnesium deficiency, manganese deficiency, lots of trace element deficiencies. And you know, we can argue about the best way to remedy that. Richard is basically saying he wants vines that are in balance. I want vines that are in balance, and I just think the best way to get those trace elements there is to generate that on your farm by having some livestock. The livestock will eat the grass. You can compost that. You can compost all the residues that come out of the winery, those skins and pips and stems, and then you can put all that back onto your vineyard. And by bringing life to your soil, because you're putting billions and billions of living organisms onto your soil, you are going to help the liberation of those macronutrients, both in the topsoil and in the subsoil. And a well-managed biodynamic vineyard. One New Zealand grower wrote to me, actually, Richard, and said, from Felton Road, you were there in 2004, and you said that the vines there were very well balanced. Now, that's not to say that Richard's an idiot. It's just to say that you know, Richard is an expert viticulturist. He can see if something is deficient or not. Sometimes biodynamics is in balance, and sometimes it isn't. But that's, if it's not in balance, it's more bad viticulture than the fault of, I think, than the fault of biodynamics. And I think, again, we're in the business of tasting. Our whole job relies on tasting. It relies on our perception, our sensual perception of a product. We don't build walls like with mortar and bricks. This wine tastes good. Now, we can all argue about whether wines taste good or not, but it seems to me that the industry in general is saying that actually these wines are now quite good. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there were some oxidised, badly made organic wines from some of the organic pioneers, and their vineyards, sure as eggs are eggs, suffered probably from the mineral deficiencies that Richard pointed out. The vineyards were out of balance, there was bad canopy management. That's just because they were bad wine growers with good intentions. Now what you're seeing is a whole generation of expert wine growers who've been, you know, the guy I trained with in California studied at Cornell. He's got a PhD in plant pathology. He's adopting biodynamics because he said it works. We can always make it, but it works because I want to make the best grapes possible. I want all of my vines to be in balance, the ones that are irrigated with overhead, the ones that are drip irrigated, the ones that are not irrigated, the ones that are on hills, the ones that are flat, the ones that are for red, the ones that are white, the ones that are machine pit, the ones that are hand pit. I want them all to be in balance for the price point wines that we're producing. And as far as he can see, that biodynamics is the best tool with which to bring those vineyards to life, to get a terroir expression, to get the quality that he and the consumer want. And that's, is that unscientific? I don't. How can it be unscientific? Just because, and also they've done some tests on the compost, some biodynamic compost in terms of fermentation temperatures, etc. And there was one done between an organic and a biodynamic compost, and pretty much came out even. And what Dave Coble, the vineyard manager at Bonterra, said, actually the key thing that what they didn't accept, which was true, was pruning weights. You go into your vineyard and you take prunings from the same vines every year for say 3 years. You choose 2 wheat vines, 2 normal vines, and 2 over vigorous vines. He said, what the biodynamic effect, we just saw a reining in across of these blocks, just reining in those vines a little bit more. And if you're reining them in a little bit more, I think that means that your vines are going to be better balanced. And a better balanced vine has a chance of producing a better balanced wine. I think in terms of carbon footprints, I think one issue that organic and biodynamic do have, or certainly organics, is if you're buying in compost, your carbon footprint will be greater, or certainly no better than a conventional grower who's buying in his fertiliser, who's buying in his weed killer. But studies have shown, David Pimentel, who's a Cornell emeritus professor at Cornell, he said if it works, it is much more green if you're actually generating that compost on site. If you're generating the manure for your compost on site, which means getting some animals on your farm, then your carbon footprint will be lower. And I was in Australia earlier on this year. Prue Henschke, who was an egghead scientist who's got more degrees than I have hot dinners in a week, she mulched under her vine, she got some cows, she bit the bullet, she composted the cow manure with all the stuff from the winery, and she's laid that as a mulch under her vines in some of these very old vineyards that she's got in a very dry climate in Eden Valley. And she said, okay, it cost me $3,000 per hectare to do this, which is a lot of upfront money, especially at the moment when everybody's nervous. The Australian industry's in crisis for various reasons. But my weed killer cost for those 3 years would have been exactly the same. If I can do it and do the organic thing, rather than having the weed killer that may result in a court case, like it did in New Zealand with spray drift, that may result in the death of a vineyard worker, as the French government has said, from a weed killer, and it's not as safe as eating a gram of table salt, as the manufacturer said in New York, because the New York court ruled against them. If I can do this and get even better quality, why would I not do that? Surely that makes sense. And she's getting better water penetration, more humus-rich soils, more nutrient release, the vines are growing more steadily, etc., etc., etc. So someone like that is saying that, and she's not really listened to, I don't think, in Australia yet, because, possibly because she's a woman, but possibly because, again, they're the most recalcitrant producer, the most anti-organic in Australia of any country on the planet. And that is because they've grown up with toys, they've grown up with stainless steel, and then they've had chilling, and then mechanical pruning and mechanical picking. And I can't believe in a magazine that one of you here writes for, with a puff piece on some guy just buying a steam weeder, get some bloody cows and mulch. Don't just, it's so easy to pick up the phone and buy a bloody steam. I can do that. Anybody in this room can do that. To make a good compost, you need to think, you need to plan, you need to engage, you need to set aside some land, you need to think about the animals, you need to look after them because that's a discipline, you need to make decent compost, and you need to do a long-term 3-year plan, not just saying, right, I'm going to buy this little toy and I'm going to write it off my vineyard order over the next 3 years. That for me is just, is idiocy. And I'm amazed that if Richard's criticising the wine industry for being pro-green, that kind of thing I do agree with, because that also makes my blood boil. If you're just going to get a green headline by buying a toy, why don't we all do that? There you go.
Thank you. So, Richard, your chance to...
Thank you. Well, Monty, I'd have to say to you that there's not much you've said that I disagree with. I very much agree with you about labour use in the countryside. It's something I do feel about, because in Australia we have an issue that our regional centres are becoming less self-sufficient because jobs are moving to the cities. And interestingly, I work with a guy here in the UK who is developing vineyards in the southeast, and he calculated that the employment of labour, comparing transforming land to vineyards compared to mechanised arable farming, is a factor of 80-fold different. It's extraordinary. And I think that's something that the English wine sector and other wine sectors should be telling the government. But when I went into print on that, a lady vigneron here in the UK said to me, that's all very well, but we can't find English people who are prepared to do farm labour. So that's the flip side of it. But I do totally agree with you that the social aspect of viticulture is very important. I also agree with you that copper and sulphur are the Achilles heel of the organic and biodynamic movement. Copper is one of the most toxic things you can apply to vineyards. The only vineyards I've ever seen that have been killed by an applied agrochemical were old vineyards in Bordeaux, in the Grape region, where they've been applying Bordeaux mixture for God knows how long, 140 years I suppose, and the copper builds up in the topsoil and it's toxic. And so these are the only vines I've ever seen killed by an agrochemical, and it's by copper, which is permitted in organic and biodynamic. So I don't think we should kid ourselves that organic and biodynamic is better for the environment. I do want to address this idea about organic and biodynamic wines being better for your health. And I wonder how much of a factor that is in the audience's perception of why they might support organic and biodynamic wine. Maybe they think it's better for the environment, which I think is nonsense. Maybe they think it's better for your health. Now there's a gentleman named Bruce Ames who knows a fair bit about cancer. He works at Berkeley, and there is an Ames test for carcinogens named after him. I suppose he developed it. And he's concerned about dietary pesticides. And I suppose you all are too, aren't you? Thinking that in the foodstuffs you eat there may be pesticides. Reasonable thing to worry about. And he has calculated that each day in America people eat 1.5 grams of pesticides. Well, a gram's not much, but probably the pesticides it's not very good for you, seeing we know a lot of them are carcinogenic. But of that 1.5 grams, there's only 0.1 milligrams that's a synthetic pesticide. Where do the rest of them come from? From plants themselves. Plants are full of pesticides. That's how they protect themselves from attack by other organisms. And this paper is all about the natural pesticides that are in our diet. Half of them that have been tested have been found to be carcinogenic. So my point to you is, while you may all get your knickers in a twist about eating agrochemicals, probably what you should do is be worried about the natural pesticides that you buy in your supermarket. And he lists here plants and fruits that contain them. There are 56 plants and fruits that you might find in your local supermarket that contain these natural pesticides that have been shown to be carcinogenic. So that's something to think about. Now the other thing I want you to think about, if I can just find my notes here, is also on this question about how safe are organic foods. And there are issues, as you may know, with E. coli because organic farmers are inclined to use manure. And Monty, I've got to say to you that the reason why I picked nitrogen deficiency to talk about is it's very hard to overcome a nitrogen deficiency using the resources on your farm. You need to have a hell of a lot of animals, which in farms of 100 or so years ago they did do. But it's not so easy now if you've got a vineyard to have enough animals to get enough nitrogen to put on your vineyard. For my part, I have no problem with putting on nitrogen that comes out of a factory. What's the big deal? It's, after all, only nitrogen. So, and the other issue is that getting back to these natural pesticides, if you drink organic cider, you are more likely to get a dose of carcinogens because it's organic cider, because those apples will have been under assault from fungi and other insects that attack them. And it's been demonstrated that organic cider has more of these products in them than otherwise. Now, I want to conclude in my remaining 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your good timekeeping. If we are concerned about the environment, I think we should be. Look at this guy who came here in green. I am an environmentalist, unashamedly an environmentalist. I'll match credentials with any of you in this room. My concern for the environment is as much as yours. Think about what vineyards do to the environment. How might we study the effect of vineyards on the environment? We might take old vineyards and compare them to the land beside them that wasn't in vineyards. And there have been studies done like that in California and in New Zealand. What do they find? There are two big differences. A, there is less carbon in the soil in the vineyards, and B, there is more compaction from driving machinery. So if you want to worry yourself about environmental pollution in vineyards, think about organic carbon in the soil and compaction. Don't worry about the chemicals. They're not the issue. So I'd put it to you that if you do want to worry about the environment, and I think you should applaud those vineyards who do the following. A, they use recycling sprayers. Now most vineyard sprayers put the spray out everywhere and some of it hits the vine. And yet you can buy a spray that catches all the non-target spray and recycles it. I think growers who use those sprays deserve a big round of applause. I think growers who use resistant varieties that don't need spraying at all deserve a round of applause. And there are several here in the UK who are growing varieties like Solaris and Mondo that require fewer sprays. Why don't they get a pat on the back from the UK wine trade?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Organic matter by way of a mulch. Okay? And lastly, the last point I want to leave you with, the greatest pollutant in our society at this point in time is carbon dioxide. And whether you're organic or biodynamic helps very little in terms of control of CO2 intake and output from the wine, grape and wine production. And with those remarks, Mr. Chairman, I shall conclude.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.